The crystal glasses clinked as guests raised their champagne in celebration. 50 years of marriage, half a century of sharing a bed, a home, hopes and dreams with the same person. The golden decorations sparkled under the elegant chandeliers of the lakeside restaurant as our friends and family gathered around us. I smoothed down the silk of my carefully chosen dress, the color of aged champagne, and watched as my husband of 50 years, Walter, cleared his throat to speak. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I have an announcement to make, he said, his voice carrying across the room with the confidence that had helped build his law practice from nothing. First, I want to thank you all for being here to celebrate this milestone with Margaret and me. He paused, his eyes not meeting mine. But tonight is about more than just celebrating the past. It's about embracing the future. That's when he reached out his hand and she stepped forward, younger than our daughter, with perfectly highlighted hair and a dress that hugged every curve. My heart stopped as Walter's voice continued, steady and unapologetic. I'd like to introduce Natalie. She's become very important to me over the past year, and I wanted you all to meet her properly. The silence in that banquet hall was deafening. I could feel 50 pairs of eyes darting between us, searching my face for the reaction, the breakdown, the scene they suddenly realized they might witness. Our children froze in horror. Our grandchildren looked confused. My sister, Patricia, gripped her husband's arm so tightly her knuckles turned white. I stood up slowly, smoothing my dress once more. "Well," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, "since we're making introductions." I gestured toward a professionally dressed woman sitting quietly at a side table. "This is Charlotte Evans, my attorney. She's been very helpful these past 6 months while I've been documenting Walter's activities and preparing divorce papers." I smiled, picked up my champagne glass, and took a sip. "To new beginnings," I said. I never expected to find myself standing in that moment. A golden anniversary celebration turned battlefield. But then again, I never expected many things about my life with Walter Jenkins. For 50 years, I had been the reliable foundation upon which Walter built his empire. When we married in 1972, he was a struggling law student with big dreams but empty pockets. I worked double shifts as a nurse to put him through school, postponing my own education. "Just until I get established," he'd promised. "Then it will be your turn." That turn never truly came. Instead, I became the perfect attorney's wife, hosting dinner parties that secured his connections, raising our children James and Andrea when he was too busy building his practice, moving to 3 different cities as he followed better opportunities. Each home, I would carefully transform from empty rooms to a welcoming haven where Walter could decompress, entertain, and showcase his success. "You have such a gift for making a house feel like home," people would tell me at parties, never realizing how much of myself I poured into those walls. While Walter's name grew in legal circles, I faded into the background. Walter Jenkins' wife, becoming my primary identity. When our children were finally grown, I mentioned returning to school. "At your age?" Walter had laughed, not unkindly, but dismissively. "Why not enjoy the life we've built instead? You've earned some rest." So I channeled my energies into community service, running charity auctions and hospital volunteer programs. My organizational skills made me invaluable, though few knew the woman behind the perfectly executed events. The first signs of Walter's wandering eye came in our 30th year of marriage. A beautiful paralegal at his firm, late-night case preparations, the classic scent of unfamiliar perfume. I confronted him once, only to have him dismiss my concerns and make me feel foolish for my suspicions. He increased my monthly allowance the following week and bought me a diamond tennis bracelet for no occasion. I buried my doubts and threw myself into planning our children's weddings, then welcomed grandchildren into our lives. These small humans who looked at me with unconditional love became my refuge. I would watch Walter bounce our granddaughter Lily on his knee and think, "This is enough. This family we've built is worth the compromises." As our 50th anniversary approached, Walter suggested an elaborate celebration. "Half a century deserves recognition," he insisted, though I would have preferred something intimate. He hired an event planner, sparing no expense. Looking back, I should have questioned his sudden interest in party planning, his insistence on inviting colleagues I barely knew, his careful attention to the guest list. 3 months before the party, I found the receipt in his jacket. A women's watch from Cartier, far too expensive for a secretary or colleague, not intended for me or our daughter. That night, I lay awake beside him, studying the profile I'd woken up to for 50 years, realizing I was looking at a stranger. The next morning, I called Patricia. "Can you recommend a good divorce attorney?" I asked without preamble. My sister, who had navigated her own divorce 15 years earlier, didn't even sound surprised. "I've been waiting for this call," she said quietly. "I have just the person." Charlotte Evans was nothing like I expected, younger than me by 2 decades, but with a steadiness that immediately put me at ease. In her office overlooking downtown Oak Ridge, I told her my suspicions, my fears, and most importantly, my realization that I couldn't continue the facade. "I've spent 50 years building his life," I told her, my voice trembling slightly. "I don't even know what mine looks like anymore." Charlotte didn't offer platitudes or immediately push for divorce. Instead, she asked me questions no one had bothered to ask in years. What did I want? What would make me feel whole? What was I afraid of losing? "Before we make any decisions," she advised, "let's understand exactly what we're dealing with. I recommend hiring a private investigator to document Mr. Jenkins's activities. If there is infidelity, it may impact your settlement in this state." The evidence came back within weeks. Walter and Natalie Harrison, a 38-year-old real estate agent he had met through a property sale, had been involved for nearly a year. Weekend trips disguised as legal conferences, dinners at restaurants 2 towns over, an apartment he had leased for their meetings. I sat in Charlotte's office, looking at photographs of my husband opening car doors for another woman, his hand resting intimately on her lower back in the way it used to rest on mine. 50 years collapsed into a stack of damning images on a sleek conference table. "I'm sorry, Margaret," Charlotte said softly. I folded my hands in my lap, spine straight. "What do we do now?" "Now we prepare. We document assets, build our case, and strategize the most advantageous time to serve papers." She hesitated. "Though I should ask, do you plan to confront him with what you know?" I thought about the anniversary celebration Walter was so eagerly planning, about the guest list he had insisted on reviewing, about the speech he'd mentioned, practicing. "No," I said, something cold and clear crystallizing in my chest. "I think I'll wait and see what he has planned." The weeks leading up to our anniversary were surreal. Walter seemed almost attentive, bringing home flowers, asking about party details. I played along, all while meeting with Charlotte, documenting our finances, and slowly, methodically, preparing for a life I never thought I'd have to build at 72. I discovered Walter had been moving money, not large sums that would raise red flags, but consistent transfers to accounts I hadn't known existed. Charlotte helped me track his financial maneuvers dating back nearly 3 years. He'd been planning too, it seemed. "He's hiding assets," Charlotte explained. "Fortunately, not very well." What Walter didn't realize was that in 50 years of marriage, I had signed countless documents, managed our household budget, and paid enough attention to understand exactly what we owned and what it was worth. I may have been invisible to him, but I hadn't been blind. The children noticed something was different. Andrea called more frequently, her voice careful when she asked, Is everything okay, Mom? You seem distracted. Just busy with the party planning, I would answer, hating the dishonesty but not ready to shatter their world before I had to. The night before our anniversary celebration, I stood in our walk-in closet, looking at the dress I had purchased. Elegant, age-appropriate, but with a quiet confidence in its lines. For 50 years, I had dressed to compliment Walter, to be the appropriate accessory to his success. Tomorrow would be different. Walter came in as I was hanging the dress back on its padded hanger, his reflection appearing behind mine in the mirror. He put hi. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Hands on my shoulders, a gesture that once would have comforted me. Big day tomorrow, he said, his eyes not quite meeting mine in the reflection. Yes, I agreed, stepping away from his touch. I think it will be quite memorable. As I lay in bed that night, I thought about the young woman who had walked down the aisle 50 years ago, carrying a bouquet of daisies because we couldn't afford roses. She had believed so completely in the power of love, in the promises made before family and God. I wished I could reach back through time and prepare her for the journey ahead. Not to warn her away from it necessarily, but to tell her to hold something back for herself. To not dissolve so completely into someone else's dream. The morning of our anniversary dawned bright and clear. Walter left early to check on details at the venue, a lie I no longer had energy to challenge. I took my time getting ready, applying makeup with more care than usual, styling my silver hair in soft waves rather than my typical conservative updo. Patricia arrived to drive me to the venue, her eyes widening slightly when she saw me. You look powerful, she said, surprise evident in her voice. I feel it, I replied, picking up my small clutch purse that contained only essentials, lipstick, a handkerchief, and a copy of the divorce papers Charlotte had prepared. For the first time in a very long time, I feel it. When we arrived, at the lakeside restaurant, guests were already gathering on the terrace for pre-dinner cocktails. I spotted Charlotte sitting unobtrusively at a corner table as we had arranged. Walter stood near the center of the room, commanding attention as always, his silver hair catching the light. I didn't see Natalie yet, but I knew she would be there. Walter's grand gesture required an audience. Our son James spotted me first, coming over to kiss my cheek. "Mom, you look amazing," he said, genuine admiration in his eyes. I wondered briefly if he had ever really seen me before, or if he too had looked past me to the carefully constructed image of motherhood I had maintained. I moved through the room, accepting congratulations and compliments, a tight smile fixed on my face. Walter watched me from across the space, a flicker of something, surprise, uncertainty, crossing his features when he saw me. Good, I thought. Let him wonder. Dinner was served, toasts were made. Our grandchildren presented us with a scrapbook they had created, chronicling our 50 years together. Looking at the smiling photos, the vacations, the holidays, the milestone celebrations, I felt a pang of genuine grief. There had been love here once, and shared dreams, and a partnership that meant something. When had it slipped away? Or had it been an illusion? All along, after dessert was served, Walter stood and clinked his glass for attention. The room quieted, all eyes turning to the man of the hour. I felt strangely calm as I watched him prepare to detonate the life we had built, and that's exactly what he did, introducing Natalie with the casual confidence of a man who had never faced consequences for his actions. The room's shocked silence was broken only by Andrea's audible gasp and James muttering, "Jesus Christ," under his breath. When I stood and introduced Charlotte, the look of utter shock on Walter's face was almost worth the 50 years of faithful service I had given him. Almost. "The papers are already prepared," I said, speaking directly to him now as murmurs rippled. through the stunned audience. "Half of everything, Walter," which is actually quite generous considering the circumstances. Natalie stepped back, her confident smile faltering as she looked between us. "You knew?" Walter finally managed, his voice uncharacteristically small. "I've known for months," I replied. "I simply waited to see what you would do. And you didn't. Disappoint." I turned to address our confused, horrified guests. "Thank you all for coming. The dinner is paid for. Please enjoy the rest of your evening. I'm afraid I need to step out for some air." I walked out of that banquet room with my head high, feeling the weight of 50 years lifting with each step. Outside on the restaurant's deck overlooking the lake, I took my first deep breath as a woman on the verge of freedom. James and Andrea found me there minutes later, their faces still registering shock and confusion. "Mom, why didn't you tell us?" Andrea asked, her voice breaking. I looked at my children, successful, independent adults with lives and families of their own, and saw them clearly, perhaps for the first time. Not as extensions of the life I had built with Walter, but as people who deserved honesty. "I needed to handle this my way," I said simply. "I've spent 50 years considering everyone else's feelings before my own. Just this once, I needed to put myself first." James shook his head, looking back toward the banquet room where chaos, presumably, still reigned. "I can't believe he would do this, to humiliate you like that, in front of everyone." I smiled, feeling a strange lightness. He thought I would crumble, that I would accept whatever scraps of dignity he left me, the way I've accepted everything else. I straightened my shoulders. He was wrong. Patricia joined us, her expression fierce with protective anger. "Charlotte's handling everything inside. Walter looks like he's been hit by a truck." "Good," Andrea said firmly, coming to stand beside me, her hand finding mine. "What happens now, Mom?" I looked out over the lake, watching the setting sun turn the water to gold. Now? Now I find out who Margaret Jenkins is when she's not defined by being Walter's wife. I squeezed my daughter's hand. "And I'm actually looking forward to meeting her." Charlotte guided me through the heavy wooden doors of the courthouse, her confident stride a stark contrast to my hesitant steps. 6 weeks had passed since the anniversary party, and today marked the first hearing in what promised to be a contentious divorce. The marble floors gleamed beneath the fluorescent lights, each click of my low heels echoing through the cavernous hallway. "Remember," Charlotte said, her voice low as we approached the courtroom, "this is just procedural. Walter's attorney will try to intimidate you with talk of prolonged litigation, but we have the documentation. Stay calm, answer only what's asked, and let me handle the rest." I nodded, clutching my handbag a little tighter. Walter had hired Gregory Palmer, a divorce attorney known for his aggressive tactics and astronomical fees. In the weeks following our public separation, Walter had shifted from shocked disbelief to calculated fury. He'd frozen the joint accounts I'd relied on for household expenses, forcing me to move in temporarily with Patricia while Charlotte filed emergency motions for temporary support. "He thinks he can starve you out," Charlotte had explained during one of our strategy sessions. "Make you desperate enough to accept less than you're entitled to." What Walter didn't know, what no one knew except Charlotte and me, was that I wasn't quite as financially vulnerable as he believed. As we rounded the corner toward courtroom C, I spotted Walter and Gregory in deep conversation. Walter wore his power suit, the charcoal gray one he reserved for his most important cases. Our eyes met briefly across the hallway. His narrowed slightly before he turned back to his attorney, dismissing me as he had so many times before. Inside the courtroom, we took our places. The proceedings moved quickly, with both attorneys presenting initial statements. Gregory painted me as a vindictive wife trying to destroy a distinguished attorney's reputation and seeking an unreasonable settlement after merely keeping his house for 50 years. Charlotte calmly countered with documented evidence of Walter's infidelity, hidden assets, and my decades of support that enabled his career. The judge, a stern-faced woman in her 60s, set dates for financial disclosure hearings and issued a temporary support order that made Walter's jaw tighten visibly. As we prepared to leave, Gregory approached Charlotte with a settlement offer whispered just loudly enough for me to hear. 20% of our marital assets and the beach cottage in Newport if I agreed to a quick, quiet resolution. Charlotte didn't even bother writing it down. "We'll see you at disclosure," she said, guiding me toward the exit. Walter caught up to us in the hallway, stepping directly into my path. "Margaret," he said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of reasoned authority he used when he thought I was being difficult. "This is unnecessary. You're turning a personal matter into a public spectacle." I met his gaze steadily. "And you turned 50 years of marriage into a punchline at our anniversary party. I guess we're both full of surprises." His eyes narrowed. "I built everything we have. Everything. You were along for the ride. Is that what helps you sleep at night?" I asked, surprised by my own calm. "Keep telling yourself that, Walter. I'm sure Natalie finds your revisionist history charming." Something ugly flashed across his face. "You won't do well on your own, Margaret. You never have. When this vindictive phase passes, you'll realize what you've thrown away." Charlotte stepped between us. "Mr. Jenkins, all communication should go through counsel. Let's go, Margaret." Outside, spring sunshine warmed my face as we descended the courthouse steps. "You did well in there," Charlotte said, checking her watch. "I have another appointment, but we can talk tomorrow about next steps." I nodded, suddenly feeling the weight of the morning. "I think I'll walk for a bit before heading home." Home was now Patricia's guest bedroom, where I'd been living since Walter changed the locks on our house. Illegally, as Charlotte had immediately pointed out, but fighting that particular battle hadn't seemed worth the energy. I wandered toward the small park across from the courthouse, finding an empty bench beneath a flowering dogwood. The petals occasionally drifted down around me, nature's gentle confetti marking a passage I hadn't chosen but was determined to navigate with dignity. My phone buzzed with a text from Andrea. "How did it go? Want me to come over later?" I typed back a brief reassurance, touched by my daughter's concern. Both James and Andrea had been stunned by their father's revelation, but after the initial shock, they'd rallied around me with surprising ferocity. Walter had attempted to paint me as unstable, vindictive, even financially irresponsible, narratives they flatly rejected based on a lifetime of watching me manage our home with careful precision. "Dad's trying to gaslight us the same way he's gaslighted you," Andrea had said during a tense family dinner the week after the party. Walter had stormed out when James asked pointed questions about his relationship with Natalie. As I sat on the bench, an elderly man settled on the opposite end, nodding politely in my direction before opening his newspaper. The normalcy of the moment struck me suddenly, sitting in a park on an ordinary Tuesday, making my own decisions about where to go and what to do next. Despite everything, there was something freeing about this new uncertainty. My phone buzzed. Again, this time with an email notification from Oak Ridge Community Bank. I opened it absently, expecting a routine alert or marketing message. Instead, I found myself staring at a notification for an account I hadn't accessed in years. Your certificate of deposit, the fund $4735,219, will mature on June 17th. Please contact us regarding renewal options. I felt a curious lightness in my chest as I tapped through to the banking app and entered the passcode, Walter's birth year, ironically enough. The account appeared on my screen, 42,783. 19. A memory surfaced, crisp and clear despite the decades that had passed. I was 37, standing in this very bank with a check for $15,000, my inheritance from my mother's modest estate. Walter had insisted we add it to our joint investment account. It's for your retirement too, I'd said quietly. We should put it somewhere safe. I handle our investments, he'd replied, that edge of impatience in his voice. This isn't enough to make any real difference. I'll add it to the Morgan Property Fund. But I hadn't. For once, I'd held firm, opening a separate account and depositing the check myself. Walter had been furious when he found out, accusing me of not trusting his financial acumen. Eventually, I'd apologized to restore peace, but I'd kept the account, adding small amounts whenever I could from my household budget, birthday checks, the occasional freelance proofreading job I took on for Walter's colleagues' wives who published cookbooks or local history compilations. I'd almost forgotten about it over the years, the automatic renewal notices going to an old email address I rarely checked. But here it was, a small fortune by my standards, accumulated through tiny acts of independence over decades of marriage. I logged out of the app, my hand trembling slightly. This wasn't enough to change the trajectory of our divorce proceedings, but it represented something far more valuable. Proof that some small, determined part of me had been planning for independence all along. My phone buzzed a third time. A text from Patricia. "You still at courthouse?" Eleanor Wilson called. Says she found boxes in her attic you might want to see. Eleanor Wilson. The name transported me across decades. Eleanor had been my closest friend during college and the early years of my marriage, until Walter's career had taken us away from Oak Ridge. We'd kept in loose contact over the years, exchanging Christmas cards and occasional phone calls, but distance and busy lives had eroded the easy intimacy we once shared. Eleanor had moved back to Oak Ridge after her husband died, purchasing her childhood home from distant relatives. I'd visited her once, shortly after her return, but Walter had been dismissive of the reconnection. "You have nothing in common anymore," he'd said. "She's a widow living on a teacher's pension, and you're a successful attorney's wife." I'd let the friendship fade again, adding it to the long list of connections I'd sacrificed for Walter's comfort. "I'll call her," I texted Patricia. As I stood to leave the park, I felt a quiet determination building. The bank account, Eleanor's call. These weren't coincidences but breadcrumbs leading me forward. Eleanor lived in the historic district, her Victorian home distinguished by its wraparound porch and meticulously maintained garden. As I approached her front gate, I spotted her kneeling among her rose bushes, gardening gloves protecting her, hands as she carefully pruned dead branches. "Margaret Jenkins," she called, straightening with a smile that transformed her face. "Or do you still go by Maggie among friends?" The question caught me off guard. Walter had always insisted on Hasiai. Margaret, claiming Maggie sounded juvenile and undignified for an attorney's wife. I'd almost forgotten the name I'd once preferred. "Maggie," I said, testing the feel of it on my tongue after so many years. "I'd like to be Maggie again." Eleanor hugged me, garden dirt and all, then led me inside. Her home was eclectic and warm, books stacked on every surface and colorful artwork lining the walls, a stark contrast to the carefully curated, professionally decorated spaces Walter had insisted upon. "Coffee?" she offered, leading me toward the kitchen. "Please." I followed her, noticing how comfortably she moved through her space, how every corner reflected her personality without apology. As she prepared the coffee, Eleanor explained her unexpected call. "I was clearing out the attic, finally tackling Michael's old files, and found a box with your name on it. Actually, it said Maggie Cooper, your maiden name. I almost didn't make the connection until I found some old photos inside." She placed a steaming mug before me, then disappeared into the hallway, returning moments later with a battered cardboard box. "Here," she said, setting it on the kitchen table. "I think you stored this with us when you and Walter were between apartments that summer before he took the job in Hartford." I stared at the box, memories stirring. Walter and I had briefly lived with Eleanor and Michael during our 5th year of marriage, when Walter was between positions and we'd given up our apartment lease. It had been a chaotic time, with most of our belongings in storage. With slightly trembling hands, I lifted the lid. Inside lay carefully preserved remnants of a life I'd almost forgotten. A leather portfolio containing sketches and watercolors from the art classes I'd taken during our first years of marriage. A half-finished manuscript, my attempt at a children's book I'd abandoned when Walter dismissed it as a hobby, not a career. Notebooks filled with story ideas, character sketches, and poems. A folder of rejection letters from publishers, each one addressed to Ms. Margaret Cooper, rather than Mrs. Walter Jenkins. "You were so talented," Eleanor said softly, sitting across from me. "I remember how excited you were about that book." I touched the manuscript pages gently. "Walter thought it was a waste of time." Eleanor's expression hardened slightly. Walter thought anything that wasn't directly benefiting him was a waste of time. She reached across the table, covering my hand with hers. "I heard about what happened at your anniversary party. The whole town's talking." I winced. I imagined they might be. "You know what they're saying?" Eleanor leaned forward. "They're saying, 'Good for Maggie, about time.'" Tears pricked at my eyes. "I'm starting over at 72, Eleanor. I'm terrified." "Starting over is just continuing. With better information," she replied, squeezing my hand. "And you're not alone." We spent the afternoon poring through the box, each item a thread connecting me to the woman I'd been before I'd sacrificed my aspirations on the altar of Walter's ambition. Eleanor made sandwiches, and we talked for hours, bridging the decades of distance with surprising ease. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Eleanor mentioned a writing group she belonged to, local authors who met weekly at the library. "You should join us," she said. "Dust off that manuscript." The suggestion was both thrilling and terrifying. I wouldn't know where to begin after all these years. "You begin by showing up," Eleanor said simply. "The words will follow." I left Eleanor's house with the box of forgotten treasures and a lightness I hadn't felt in years. Driving back to Patricia's, I took a detour past the house Walter and I had shared for the last 20 years. A sprawling colonial on Oak Ridge's most prestigious street. Walter's car wasn't in the driveway, but another vehicle was parked there. A sleek red convertible I recognized as Natalie's. She had moved in then. The knowledge should have hurt more than it did. I continued driving, suddenly struck by the realization that I felt no desire to return to that house, regardless of what the divorce settlement might eventually grant me. It had never really been mine. Just another showcase for Walter's success, designed and decorated according to his preferences and social aspirations. Patricia was cooking when I arrived, the scent of garlic and herbs filling her modest bungalow. "Find anything interesting at Eleanor's?" she asked, stirring a pot of what appeared to be her famous vegetable soup. I placed the box on her kitchen counter. "Just some old artwork and writings, things I'd forgotten about." Patricia peered into the box, lifting out a sketch of a coastline. "You were good," she said, sounding surprised. "I never knew you kept up with your art after college." "I didn't," I replied. "Not really. Walter thought it was impractical." Patricia's expression darkened. She'd never particularly liked Walter, though she'd kept her opinions mostly to herself over the decades of our marriage. "Well, Walter's opinions matter significantly less now, don't they?" She handed me a glass of wine. "Charlotte called while you were out. She wants you to come by her office tomorrow morning. Says she found something interesting in Walter's financial disclosures." I sipped the wine, curiosity piqued. "Did she say what?" "No, but she sounded pleased." Patricia returned to her soup, adding a pinch of herbs. "Have you thought about what you want to do after all this is settled? Where you want to live?" The question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on surviving the present crisis that I'd given little thought to what came next. "Not really," I admitted. "Right now, I'm just trying to get through each day." "You could travel," Patricia suggested. You always wanted to see Europe, and Walter always had an excuse why you couldn't. Going, it was true. Every time I'd broached the subject of international travel, Walter had countered with reasons why it wasn't the right time. His caseload, the expense, his preference for familiar comforts. The few vacations we'd taken had been to legal conferences, in resort locations where Walter networked while I attended spouse activities with the other partners' wives. Maybe, I said, the possibility unfurling like a flag in my mind. After everything settled. That night, sleep eluded me. I lay in Patricia's guest bed, surrounded by borrowed comfort, thinking about the box from Eleanor, about the young woman who had created those paintings and stories, who had dreamed of something beyond being Walter Jenkins' wife. Had she been buried forever, or merely dormant? I rose early, drawn to the box I'd left in the corner of the room. Sitting cross-legged on the bed, I re-examined each item by the gentle morning light filtering through lace curtains. The children's book manuscript was better than I remembered. A simple but engaging story about a young girl who discovers she can hear plants talking. I'd illustrated it myself with whimsical watercolors that, looking at them now, showed genuine talent. Alongside the manuscript was a rejection letter from Harper & Row, dated 1978. While your story shows promise, it read, we are unable to offer publication at this time. We encourage you to continue developing your unique voice. I'd never shown Walter that letter, with its encouragement buried within the rejection. I'd simply put the manuscript away after he'd made his opinion clear. Children's books are a dime a dozen, Margaret. You'd be competing with professional writers and artists. Be realistic. How different might my life have been if I'd persisted? If I'd believed in my voice more than I believed in Walter's dismissal of it. I carefully repacked the box and dressed for my meeting with Charlotte. The day promised to be warm, so I chose a light sundress from the limited wardrobe I'd brought. To Patricia's, another area where Walter had exerted control, insisting I dress appropriately for my position in muted colors and conservative styles. Charlotte's office occupied the top floor of a renovated factory building downtown, its industrial bones softened by modern furnishings and abundant natural light. Her assistant showed me into the conference room where Charlotte waited, surrounded by documents. Good morning, she said, standing to greet me. Thank you for coming in so promptly. I found something interesting in Walter's financial disclosures. She gestured to the chair beside her, angling her laptop screen so I could see it. Walter owns a property I don't think you know about, a beach house in Westerly, purchased 3 years ago through a limited liability company called Jenkins Coastal Holdings. I frowned. We have the cottage in Newport, but I don't know anything about a place in Westerly. Charlotte nodded. That's because he never put it in your joint names. He bought it outright for $425,000. She turned the laptop to show me photographs of a modern glass and cedar structure perched on dunes overlooking the Atlantic. It's quite impressive, and completely absent from any of the asset discussions he's had with you over the past 3 years. I stared at the images, a cold realization settling in my stomach. The trips to check on rental properties, I murmured. He said he was considering real estate investments. He was, Charlotte said grimly, just not ones he intended to share with you. She clicked through additional documents. The purchase coincides with the beginning of his relationship with Natalie based on the evidence we've gathered. A love nest, then. Bought with marital funds but hidden from me, intended as a private retreat for Walter and his much younger girlfriend. Is this good for our case? I asked, struggling to process this new betrayal. Charlotte smiled, a sharp expression that reminded me why she'd earned her reputation as one of the state's most formidable divorce attorneys. It's excellent for our case. Hiding assets is a serious offense in divorce proceedings. The judge can impose sanctions, and in some cases, award the wronged spouse a larger percentage of the marital estate as a consequence. She closed her laptop. But there's more. In reviewing Walter's recent financial activities, I found something else. She slid a folder across the table. These are statements from an account at First Providence Bank, opened 28 years. Go. The initial deposit was $175,000, your inheritance from your father's estate. I took the folder with trembling hands. I remembered that inheritance, the family farm in western Massachusetts, sold after my father's death. Walter had insisted we invested in his firm's expansion. The account balance as of last month was just over $2 million, Charlotte continued. Walter has been managing this money all these years, using it for various investments, but it's still traceable to your inheritance, which under state law remains separate property if not commingled with marital assets. I stared at her, struggling to comprehend. Are you saying? I'm saying that regardless of what happens with the division of your marital property, this money is legally yours. It should have been disclosed to you years ago, but Walter kept it separate. Ironically, that works in your favor now. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Over $1 million. My money. Money Walter had deliberately hidden from me. Perhaps intending to exclude it from our divorce settlement entirely. There's a certain poetic justice here, Charlotte said, her expression softening. He tried to hide your money from you, but in doing so, he's guaranteed you'll get all of it instead of just half. I closed the folder, a strange calm settling over me. What happens now? Now we adjust our strategy. We file motions regarding the hidden property and the undisclosed account. We use these discoveries to strengthen our position for the settlement conference next month. Charlotte leaned forward. Margaret, this changes everything. You're not just fighting for what you're entitled to from 50 years of marriage. You're fighting for what was already yours that he tried to keep from you. As I left Charlotte's office, spring sunshine warmed my face. I walked without any particular destination, my mind churning with revelations. Walter had hidden not just his infidelity but significant assets that would now ensure my financial independence regardless of how contentious the divorce became. I found myself approaching the public library, its brick facade and grand. Steps familiar from the days when I'd bring James and Andrea for story time as children. Without consciously deciding to, I climbed those steps and entered the cool, book-scented interior. The information desk was staffed by a young woman with vibrant blue hair who smiled warmly as I approached. Can I help you find something? I'm looking for information about the writing group that meets here, I said, surprising myself. Eleanor Wilson mentioned it. Oh, the Oak Ridge Writers' Circle. They meet Thursday evenings in the community room. She handed me a flyer. They're always welcoming new members. Are you a writer? The question hung in the air between us. Was I? Had I ever been, truly? Or had I simply been a woman with dreams I'd set aside? Yes, I said, the word feeling strange and wonderful on my tongue. Yes, I am. The clock struck 7 as I arrived at the library's community room, clutching my manuscript pages with fingers that trembled slightly. Through the glass door, I could see a circle of 8 people already seated, some with laptops open, others with notebooks and pens. I hesitated, suddenly questioning my decision to come. What did I have to offer this group of writers? My story had been rejected decades ago, my creative muscles atrophied from disuse. As I stood frozen in indecision, the door swung open and Eleanor appeared, her face lighting up at the sight of me. You came. I was hoping you would. She tugged me gently into the room, addressing the group. Everyone, this is my dear friend Maggie. She's joining us tonight. 7 curious faces turned toward me with varying expressions of welcome. Eleanor guided me to an empty chair and made quick introductions. Robert, a retired high school English teacher working on a historical novel. Sophia, a young mother writing fantasy stories during her children's nap times. Thomas, a community college professor focused on poetry. Grace, who wrote mystery novels under a pen name. Henry, a former journalist working on his memoir, Michelle, who specialized in young adult fiction, and Diane, who wrote and illustrated children's books. It was Diane who immediately leaned forward, her eyes bright with interest. Eleanor mentioned you write children's stories too. I'd love to hear about your work. I clutched my manuscript tighter, suddenly self-conscious. It was a long time ago. I never published anything. Publication isn't what makes someone a writer, Robert said kindly. Writing makes you a writer. The meeting began formally then, with members taking turns sharing their current projects and receiving constructive feedback. I listened attentively, impressed by the quality of both the writing and the thoughtful critique. These weren't hobbyists, but serious writers committed to their craft. When my turn came, Eleanor encouraged me gently. Would you like to read a bit from your manuscript, Maggie? Hesitantly, I opened the faded folder and began reading about Lily, a little girl who discovers she can hear flowers speaking after her grandmother gives her a special gardening hat. My voice trembled at first, but grew stronger as I lost myself in the story, remembering the joy I'd felt creating it all those years ago. When I finished, the room was silent for a moment. Then Diane spoke, her voice warm with genuine enthusiasm. This is charming. The concept is timeless, and children would still connect with it today. Others nodded in agreement, offering specific praise for the dialogue and pacing. Have you considered revisiting it? Grace asked. The children's book market has changed, but there's definitely a place for this kind of gentle fantasy. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed insistently in my purse. Excusing myself, I stepped into the hallway to see James's name on the screen. Mom? His voice sounded strained. Where are you? At the library. Is everything all right? Dad just called me, ranting about you hiring a private investigator to spy on him and trying to steal his retirement accounts. James sighed heavily. He's been drinking, I think. He wanted me to talk some sense into you. I pressed my fingers against my temple, feeling a headache forming. Your father is upset because Charlotte found some financial irregularities. They're relevant to the divorce proceedings, that's all. He's saying you've turned vindictive, that you're trying to ruin him professionally. James paused. I know it's not true, Mom. I just thought you should know what he's telling people. After reassuring James and ending the call, I leaned against the wall, eyes closed. Of course Walter would try to control the narrative, to paint himself as the victim rather than the architect of our situation. It was a tactic he'd employed countless times in his legal practice, reshaping the story to benefit his client regardless of facts. When I returned to the writing group, Eleanor immediately sensed my distress. Everything okay? She whispered as the discussion continued around us. I nodded, unwilling to bring my personal troubles into this creative sanctuary. For the remainder of the meeting, I forced myself to focus on the others' stories, offering occasional comments when I felt I had something worthwhile to contribute. As the meeting dispersed, Diane approached me with her contact information written on a library note card. I meant what I said about your story. If you're interested in updating it, I'd be happy to give you some insights about the current market. I have a friend who's an editor at Little Harbor Press. I took the card, touched by her generosity. Thank you. I'll think about it. Outside, the evening air had turned cool, stars appearing in the darkening sky. Eleanor linked her arm through mine as we walked toward the parking lot. So, what did you think? They're all so talented, I said, and serious about their writing. So were you once, she replied pointedly. You could be again. I didn't answer immediately, my mind still tangled in James's call and Walter's accusations. Walter's telling the children I've turned vindictive, I finally said, that I'm trying to ruin him. Eleanor snorted derisively. Walter would say the sun rises in the west if it served his purposes. She squeezed my arm. Don't let him drag you back into his reality, Maggie. You've just started finding your own. I drove back to Patricia's house slowly, processing the evening. The warmth of the writing group juxtaposed against the cold. Reminder that Walter was mobilizing against me, not just legally but socially. As I turned onto Patricia's street, I noticed an unfamiliar car parked in her driveway, a sleek black Mercedes with tinted windows. Patricia met me at the door, her expression tight with controlled anger. "You have a visitor," she said quietly. I told her she should have called first, but she insisted on waiting. I stepped into the living room to find Natalie perched uncomfortably on Patricia's floral sofa, looking out of place in her expensive designer outfit. She stood when she saw me, smoothing her skirt with manicured hands. "Mrs. Jenkins," she began, then stopped, seeming to recalibrate. "Margaret, I was hoping we could talk." Patricia hovered protectively nearby. "I'll be in the kitchen if you need me," she said pointedly, giving Natalie a look that could have frozen water before retreating. I sat in the armchair opposite Natalie, acutely aware of my library casual attire compared to her polished appearance. "This is unexpected," I said simply. Natalie sat back down, crossing her legs carefully. "I wanted to speak with you directly, without Walter or the lawyers involved." She hesitated, her confidence seemingly less solid than it had appeared at first glance. "I never intended for things to happen the way they did at your anniversary party. That was Walter's idea, and I realize now it was cruel." I studied her face, trying to gauge her sincerity. She was younger than Andrea, probably in her late 30s, beautiful in a cultivated way that spoke of careful maintenance and considerable expense. "Why are you here, Natalie?" She leaned forward slightly. "Walter is becoming difficult. He's angry about the financial discoveries your attorney made. He feels cornered." She twisted the expensive ring on her right hand. "He's talking about fighting you all the way to the state Supreme Court if necessary." "That would be expensive," I observed, "and ultimately futile, given the documentation we have." "I know," she said quickly. "That's why I'm here. I was hoping I could convince you to consider a reasonable settlement, something that would allow everyone to move forward without years of legal battles." I nearly laughed at the absurdity. Walter had sent his girlfriend to negotiate on his behalf, as if her youth and beauty might sway me where legal arguments couldn't. "And what does Walter consider reasonable?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "He's prepared to offer 40% of the disclosed marital assets, including the Newport cottage." She delivered this as if announcing a generous concession. "And the beach house in Westerly?" I asked, pointedly. "The one purchased with marital funds but kept hidden? Or my father's inheritance that Walter invested without my knowledge?" Natalie's expression flickered, revealing surprise before she masked it. "I'm not familiar with all the details," she said carefully. "No, I imagine Walter hasn't been entirely forthcoming with you either." I stood, signaling the end of our conversation. "Please tell Walter that all settlement discussions should go through our attorneys. Charlotte Evans has my complete confidence." Natalie rose as well, her composure slipping slightly. "He won't stop, you know. When Walter sets his mind on something, he becomes obsessive. This could drag on for years." "I have time," I replied simply, "and right of law on my side." She reached for her designer handbag, then paused. "For what it's worth, I never set out to break up your marriage. Walter told me it had been over between you for years, that you stayed together only for appearances. The familiar narrative, the cheating spouse claiming a dead marriage to justify infidelity, was so predictable it almost didn't sting. 50 years is a long time to maintain appearances, don't you think?" I moved toward the front door, holding it open. "Good night, Natalie." After she left, Patricia emerged from the kitchen, 2 glasses of wine in hand. "Well, that took nerve," she said, handing me one. "Walter sending his mistress to do his dirty work." I sank onto the sofa, suddenly exhausted. He's getting desperate. Charlotte has uncovered too much for him to maintain the fiction that he's been honest about our finances. Patricia sat beside me. "What will you do?" I sipped the wine, considering. Exactly what I've been doing. Moving forward one day at a time, letting Charlotte handle the legal aspects. I thought about the writing group, about Diane's encouragement regarding my children's story, and perhaps rediscovering parts of myself I set aside long ago. 2 days later, I received a call from Charlotte. Walter's attorney has requested an urgent meeting, she said without preamble. Apparently, they have a good faith settlement offer they want to present in person. After sending Natalie to try to negotiate directly, I couldn't keep the skepticism from my voice. You had a visit from the girlfriend? Charlotte sounded both surprised and grimly amused. That's a new tactic. What did she offer? 40% of the disclosed assets, including the Newport cottage, I replied. Charlotte made a dismissive noise. Insulting, considering what we now know. But this meeting request comes directly from Gregory Palmer, and he's smart enough not to waste our time with lowball offers. Shall I schedule it for tomorrow morning? The following day, Charlotte and I arrived at the offices of Palmer, Whitmore and Associates, an imposing glass building in downtown Providence. Gregory Palmer himself greeted us in the marble-floored lobby, his handshake firm, his smile not reaching his eyes. Thank you for agreeing to meet on such short notice, he said, leading us to a conference room where Walter already waited, impeccably dressed in one of his court suits, his expression carefully neutral. Once we were seated, Gregory began with practiced smoothness. We appreciate your willingness to discuss settlement options outside of formal court proceedings. My client is eager to resolve this matter efficiently and equitably. Charlotte's expression remained professional but skeptical. We're always open to reasonable solutions, provided they acknowledge all marital assets, including those recently discovered. Gregory smiled thinly. Indeed. After reviewing the, additional information your office provided, we've prepared a comprehensive settlement proposal. He slid folders across the table to both of us. You'll find it addresses the concerns you've raised regarding previously undisclosed assets. I opened the folder to find a detailed financial breakdown. Walter was now offering 60% of the total marital estate, including both the Newport cottage and the Westerly beach house, along with full return of my father's inheritance, and its accumulated growth. In exchange, he would retain ownership of his law practice and the primary residence. Charlotte reviewed the documents with practiced efficiency, occasionally making notes in the margins. This is certainly closer to a reasonable starting point, she said finally. Though there are several areas that require adjustment, particularly regarding retirement accounts and future income from the firm's ongoing cases. Walter spoke for the first time, his voice carrying that carefully modulated authority he used when addressing juries. I believe this offer demonstrates my sincere desire to conclude this unfortunate situation fairly, Margaret. Neither of us benefits from prolonged litigation. I met his gaze steadily, remembering Natalie's warning about his determination to fight. Something had changed his mind, or forced his hand. What prompted this sudden interest in settlement, Walter? Last I heard, you were considering appeals to the state Supreme Court. A muscle in his jaw twitched, the only crack in his composed facade. Gregory answered smoothly in his place. My client recognizes the wisdom of focusing on the future rather than prolonging matters that serve neither party's interests. Charlotte closed her folder. We'll need time to review this proposal thoroughly. I suggest we schedule a follow-up meeting next week after my client has had the opportunity to consider all aspects. As we prepared to leave, Walter stood. Margaret, may I have a word in private? Charlotte gave me a questioning look. I nodded. Slightly. I could handle Walter. She and Gregory stepped into the hallway, leaving Walter and me alone in the conference room. You've made your point, Walter said once the door closed, his voice lower, less controlled. You've shown everyone you won't be dismissed or overlooked. I respect that. I regarded him silently, waiting for him to continue. This offer is more than fair, he pressed. You could live very comfortably for the rest of your life. Travel, pursue whatever interests you've developed suddenly. His tone carried a hint of condescension, as if my interests could only be recent and superficial. Why the change of heart, Walter? I asked directly. You sent Natalie to offer me 40% 2 days ago. Now you're proposing 60+. The beach house. What's different? His expression tightened. Several of my partners are concerned about the firm's reputation if details of our financial arrangements become public record through prolonged divorce proceedings. They've encouraged me to resolve this quickly. Not a change of heart, but external pressure. Walter's partners were worried about how his hidden assets and financial maneuvers might reflect on their practice if fully exposed in court. They were protecting themselves, and by extension, forcing Walter to offer me a more reasonable settlement. I'll review the proposal with Charlotte, I said neutrally. As she mentioned, there are still areas that need adjustment. Walter's composure slipped further, frustration breaking through. What more do you want, Margaret? You've already affected my standing with the firm, damaged my reputation in the community. I didn't do those things, Walter, I interrupted quietly. You did. When you decided to lie about our finances. When you chose to humiliate me publicly at our anniversary party. Every consequence you're facing is the direct result of your own actions. He stared at me as if seeing someone unfamiliar. Perhaps he was. The Margaret he knew, the accommodating wife who prioritized his needs and reputation above all else, had ceased to exist the moment he introduced Natalie to our friends and family. We built a life together, he said finally, his voice strained. 50 years, Margaret. Does that count for nothing now? The question struck deeper than I expected, touching a tender place where grief for what we'd lost still lingered. It counted for everything to me, Walter. That's why I stayed faithful. Why I supported your career at the expense of my own aspirations. Why I created a home where you could thrive. I gathered my purse, preparing to leave. You're the one who decided it counted for nothing when you replaced me without so much as a private conversation first. In the hallway, Charlotte waited, while Gregory had stepped away to take a call. Everything all right? She asked, noting my expression. Fine, I assured her. Walter's partners are pressuring him to settle quickly. They're worried about their firm's reputation if all the financial details become public record. Charlotte's lips curved in a satisfied smile. Excellent. That gives us additional leverage for the remaining negotiation points. On the drive back to Oak Ridge, Charlotte outlined the strengths and weaknesses of Walter's offer, identifying areas where we could reasonably push for more. I listened with half my attention, the other half still caught in that conference room, in Walter's question about our 50 years together. Did those years count for nothing? Of course they didn't. They had shaped me, given me my children, provided a framework for my entire adult life. But they weren't a blank check Walter could use to justify his betrayal, nor were they a chain binding me to patterns of accommodation that no longer served me. The next day, I joined Eleanor for lunch at a small cafe overlooking the harbor. The spring warmth had brought sailboats out, their white sails bright against the blue water. Eleanor listened attentively as I described Walter's settlement offer and our brief private conversation afterward. He sounds surprised that you're not following his script, she observed, stirring her iced tea. As if he expected you to either collapse in heartbroken despair or play the vengeful ex-wife, and you're doing neither. I'm not interested in vengeance, I said truthfully. I just want what's fair, what I've earned through 50 years of partnership. Eleanor nodded, then fixed me with a direct look. Have you thought more about Diane's offer to connect you with her editor friend? I hesitated. In the midst of divorce negotiations and rebuilding my life, Revisiting my abandoned creative aspirations seemed almost self-indulgent. I'm not sure this is the right time. When will it be the right time? Eleanor challenged gently. You've already waited decades, Maggie. How much longer will you postpone your own dreams? Before I could respond, my phone rang, Andrea calling. I excused myself to answer. Mom! Her voice sounded strained. Are you free to talk? Of course, sweetheart. Is everything all right? She exhaled heavily. Not really. Dad showed up at my office today, asking me to help convince you to accept his settlement offer. He brought Natalie with him. I closed, my eyes briefly, imagining the scene. My daughter confronted at her workplace by her father and his girlfriend, put in an impossible position. I'm so sorry, Andrea. That was completely inappropriate of him. It was mortifying, she confirmed. My colleagues saw them in the reception area. Dad was going on about family loyalty and how you're being unreasonable. Her voice hardened. I told him he lost the right to discuss family loyalty when he brought his mistress to your anniversary party. Pride in my daughter's strength mingled with regret that she'd been drawn into the conflict. You shouldn't have to deal with this, Andrea. Neither should you, Mom, but that's not why I called. She paused. Natalie said something weird as they were leaving. She mentioned being dragged into your drama when she already has enough stress with the pregnancy. The words hit me like a physical blow. Pregnancy? That's what she said. Dad immediately hustled her out, but not before I heard it clearly. Andrea's voice softened with concern. I thought you should know. Are you okay? Was I okay? I wasn't sure how to answer. The news that Natalie was pregnant with Walter's child stirred a complex mix of emotions. Shock, a distant sort of grief for what might have been if Walter had wanted more children when we were younger, and strangely, a kind of pity for Natalie. At 38 or 39, she was embarking on motherhood with a man in his 70s who had already proven himself capable of profound betrayal. I'm fine, I assured Andrea, my voice steadier than I felt. It's unexpected news, but it doesn't change anything about my situation. After ending the call, I returned to Eleanor, who read my expression immediately. What's happened? Natalie is pregnant, I said, the words still sounding surreal. Walter is going to be a father again at 74. Eleanor's eyes widened. Well, that explains the sudden push to settle the divorce quickly. He needs to know what financial resources he'll have available for his new family. Her practical assessment helped ground me. Yes, I suppose he does. How do you feel about it? Eleanor asked carefully. I considered the question, searching for the pain or jealousy that might seem natural in this situation. Instead, I found myself feeling strangely detached, as if hearing about distant acquaintances rather than my husband of 50 years. Relieved, oddly enough, I said finally. This confirms what I already knew. Walter has moved on to a completely different life. One that has nothing to do with me or the decades we spent together. Eleanor reached across the table to squeeze my hand. And you're building a new life too. One that has nothing to do with him. That evening, I called Charlotte to inform her about Natalie's pregnancy, knowing it might impact our negotiation strategy. Her reaction was professionally measured, but personally empathetic. This certainly adds context to Walter's sudden interest in settlement, she agreed. We can use this information to push for better terms on the retirement accounts, knowing he's likely trying to free up liquid assets for his new family obligations. I agreed with her assessment, then hesitated before adding, Charlotte, I've been thinking. The house, our primary residence. Walter's offer includes him keeping it with financial compensation to me for my share. That's right, she confirmed. Based on current market value, that would amount to approximately $700,000. Is that aspect of the proposal concerning you? Not exactly. I'm realizing I don't actually want the house. even if I could get it in the settlement. It's too large for one person, full of memories I'd rather not revisit daily, and I paused, formulating the thought as I spoke it. And I think I'd like to start fresh somewhere completely new. Charlotte was quiet for a moment. That's entirely your prerogative, Margaret. We can certainly negotiate the financial terms of Walter keeping the house without pushing for ownership. Did you have something specific in mind for your own living situation? I thought about Eleanor's Victorian in the historic district, about the writing group at the library, about the harbor view from the cafe where we'd had lunch. I think I might like to stay in Oak Ridge, actually, but in a place that's completely my own, that has no connection to Walter or our marriage. That sounds like a very healthy perspective, Charlotte said, her voice warming slightly beyond its usual professional tone. We can start focusing our property settlement discussions on ensuring you have the resources to establish yourself exactly as you choose. After we ended the call, I found myself drawn to the box of creative materials from Eleanor's attic. I removed my old manuscript and spread the pages on Patricia's guest room bed, reading the story again with fresh eyes. The young woman who had written these words had believed in herself enough to create something from nothing, to imagine a world where little girls could hear flowers speak. I pulled out my phone and texted Diane from the writing group. I'd like to take you up on your offer to connect with your editor friend. My story might need some updating, but I think I'm ready to try again. Her response came almost immediately. Wonderful. Let's meet for coffee tomorrow and discuss revisions. Your story has real potential, Maggie. As I carefully repacked the manuscript, my phone buzzed with another text. This one from James. Just heard about Natalie from Andrea. Are you okay? Need company tonight? I smiled at my son's concern. I'm fine. Having a quiet evening working on an old writing project. Would love to see you this weekend, though. Writing project? He responded, adding a curious emoji. A children's book I started many years ago. I'm thinking of trying to publish it. 3 dots appeared as he typed, then, Mom, that's amazing. I had no idea you wrote. Can't wait to hear more about it. Neither could I realized. After decades of putting my creative aspirations aside, of being Walter's wife rather than Maggie Cooper with dreams of her own, I was reclaiming a piece of myself I'd nearly forgotten existed. The timing wasn't perfect. Divorce proceedings, financial negotiations, and the emotional aftermath of betrayal hardly created ideal conditions for creative renaissance. But perhaps there would never be a perfect time. Perhaps now, messy, uncertain, challenging now, was exactly when I needed to remember who I had been before Walter and who I might become after him. The following morning dawned bright and clear. I dressed with unusual care for my coffee meeting with Diane, selecting a blouse in a vibrant teal that Patricia had encouraged me to buy. It brings out your eyes, Maggie, and it's time you wore something besides Walter's approved neutral palette. As I gathered my manuscript pages and stepped out onto Patricia's porch, I noticed a familiar car parked across the street, Walter's black BMW. He sat in the driver's seat, watching the house. When he saw me, he got out and approached, his expression unreadable. Margaret, he said, stopping at the foot of the porch steps. I was hoping to speak with you. I remained on the porch, manuscript folder clutched to my chest. I thought, we agreed all communication should go through our attorneys. This isn't about the divorce, not directly. He glanced at the folder I held but didn't comment on it. Andrea told you about Natalie's pregnancy? I nodded, not trusting myself. To speak. Standing on Patricia's porch in my bright teal blouse, holding the creative work I planned to resurrect, I felt painfully aware of how much had changed between us. Walter ran a hand through his silver hair, a gesture of frustration I recognized, from countless disagreements over the years. I wanted you to hear it from me, not secondhand. I owed you that much. He looked genuinely distressed, though whether from guilt or simply the awkwardness of the situation, I couldn't tell. "Is that all?" I asked when he didn't continue. He looked up at me, his expression shifting to something closer to bewilderment. "You're different," he said finally. "Since the party, since all this began, you've changed." "Not changed, I," corrected quietly. "Remembered. I'm remembering the woman I was before I devoted my entire identity to being your wife." He flinched slightly, his gaze dropping to the manuscript folder again. "What's that?" "A children's book I wrote 30 years ago. I'm revising it." I met his gaze steadily. "You told me it was a waste of time then. You were wrong." Walter seemed at a loss for words, perhaps for the first time in our long relationship. Finally, he nodded once, a gesture that might have been acknowledgement or merely resignation. "I should go. Charlotte and Gregory are meeting this afternoon about the settlement adjustments." "Yes, they are." I checked my watch. "And I have a meeting of my own to get to." He turned to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, Margaret, I did love you. In my way." "I know," I said softly. "It just wasn't the way I needed to be loved." As his car pulled away, I descended the porch steps, feeling oddly lightened by the encounter. Walter had seen me, really seen me perhaps for the first time in decades, not as an extension of himself or a supportive element of his life, but as a separate person with valid dreams and capabilities of my own. Whether he understood what he saw was another matter entirely, but his recognition or lack thereof no longer defined my worth. That chapter of my life was closing, and a new one written entirely in my own voice, was finally beginning. The realtor handed me the keys with a warm smile, the small brass pieces cool against my palm. "Congratulations, Maggie. The house is officially yours." I stood in the empty living room of my new home, sunlight streaming through large windows that overlooked a modest garden. The cottage was nothing like the sprawling colonial Walter and I had shared. This was a compact 2-bedroom arts and crafts bungalow in Oak Ridge's historic district, just 3 blocks from Eleanor's Victorian and a short walk to the library. Built in the 1920s, it featured original woodwork, a Riverstone fireplace, and a kitchen that would need updating eventually, but felt immediately like mine in a way no space had for decades. "I can't believe how quickly everything came together," I said, turning to Charlotte, who had accompanied me to the closing. "A month ago, I was still living in Patricia's guest room." Charlotte set her briefcase on the window seat, satisfaction evident in her typically composed expression. "The settlement provided the resources, but this was all your doing, Maggie. You found this place, envisioned its potential, and moved decisively to secure it." The settlement. After Natalie's pregnancy became known, Walter had become surprisingly amenable to Charlotte's additional terms, accepting an adjusted division that granted me a larger portion of our investment portfolio and retirement funds. The divorce had been finalized 2 weeks ago, the legal process concluding with remarkably little drama, given how it had begun. I moved toward the kitchen, running my hand along the countertop. "I'm having new appliances delivered tomorrow, and Patricia is helping me shop for furniture this weekend. I should be fully moved in by next week." Charlotte nodded, checking her watch. "I have a court appearance at 2, but I wanted to see you get your keys." She hesitated, her professional demeanor softening slightly. "It's been a privilege working with you, Maggie. Not all clients navigate this transition with such grace." I smiled, touched by her words. Charlotte had been more than just my attorney. Through this process, she'd been a steady guide as I reconstructed my life without Walter at its center. I couldn't have done it without you. After Charlotte left, I wandered through my new home, mentally placing furniture and imagining morning. Coffee in the breakfast nook, quiet evenings reading by the fireplace, family gatherings around a dining table I had yet to buy. For the first time in my adult life, I would create a space that reflected only my preferences, my comfort, my aesthetic. I was measuring the living room windows for curtains when my phone rang. Andrea's name flashed on the screen. "Did you get the keys?" she asked immediately. "How does it feel?" "Wonderful," I replied honestly. "A little overwhelming, but in the best way. When can you come see it?" "That's actually why I'm calling. James and I want to organize a housewarming for you next weekend, once you're settled in. Nothing elaborate, just family and a few close friends to welcome you to your new home. Would that be all right?" The thoughtfulness of the gesture brought tears to my eyes. Through the divorce, both my children had been steadfastly supportive, expressing concern for my well-being while maintaining civil, if distant, relationships with their father. "That would be lovely, sweetheart. Thank you." "Great. I'll coordinate with James and text you details. And Mom, I'm really proud of you." After we hung up, I continued my measurements, making notes for curtains and blinds. As I worked, I found myself humming softly, a habit Walter had always found irritating, but that now felt like another small reclamation of self. The doorbell chimed, startling me. Probably another neighbor welcoming me to the street, I thought, heading toward the front door. Several residents had already stopped by since I'd begun the moving process, bringing small gifts and offers of assistance, a community warmth I hadn't experienced in our exclusive neighborhood with Walter. I opened the door to find not a neighbor, but Gerald Banks, Walter's longtime law partner. He stood on my new porch looking distinctly uncomfortable, his tall frame stiff in an expensive suit. "Margaret," he said, nodding formally. "I hope I'm not intruding." Surprise kept me momentarily silent. I'd known Gerald for over 30 years, but had never exchanged more than polite pleasantries with him at firm functions. Walter had always managed my social interactions with his colleagues, determining which partners' wives were suitable company for me. "Gerald," I finally managed, "this is unexpected. Please come in." I gestured to the empty living room. "I'm afraid I don't have anywhere to offer you to sit yet." He entered hesitantly, looking around the modest space. "Nice place. Very. Cozy." I waited, sensing he hadn't come to discuss my decorating choices. "What can I do for you, Gerald?" He cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "I wanted to speak with you directly, Margaret, about Walter." He paused, seemed to consider his words carefully. "There's been some concerning behavior recently. I thought you should know." A familiar tension crept up my spine, the automatic response to Walter's problems that I'd cultivated over 50 years. I consciously relaxed my shoulders, reminding myself that Walter's issues were no longer mine to solve. "What kind of behavior?" Gerald shifted his weight, his discomfort palpable. "He's been erratic at work, missing client meetings, submitting briefs late, showing up unprepared for court appearances. Last week, Judge Harmon threatened to hold him in contempt." He sighed heavily. "The partners are concerned. Walter's always been the backbone of our litigation department, but now—" "I'm sorry to hear that," I said carefully. "But I'm not sure why you're bringing this to me. Walter and I are divorced. His professional challenges are between him and the firm." Gerald met my gaze directly. "He's drinking, Margaret, not just socially, but during the day. We found empty bottles in his office desk. 2 clients have complained about smelling alcohol on his breath during morning consultations." The revelation struck me harder than I would have expected. Walter had always been disciplined about his drinking. A scotch after work, wine with dinner, never to excess, and certainly never during business hours. This behavior represented a fundamental departure from the man I'd known. "That doesn't sound like Walter," I said quietly. "It's not," Gerald agreed. "At least, not the Walter we've known for 40 years. But since your divorce, since the development with Natalie, he's changed." I frowned, a suspicion forming. "Gerald, why exactly are you telling me this? Surely the firm has protocols for handling partners in crisis." He had the grace to look slightly abashed. The partnership agreement gives us limited options unless Walter agrees to take a leave of absence for treatment. He's refusing, insisting. He's fine. He hesitated. We thought perhaps you might speak with him. He respected your opinion, even if... He stopped himself. Even if he didn't respect our marriage vows? I finished for him, unable to keep a hint of bitterness from my voice. Gerald, I'm the last person Walter would listen to right now. Maybe, he conceded. But your children have tried, and he brushed them off. Natalie is concerned about the stress affecting her pregnancy. You knew him longer than anyone, Margaret. You might see a way to reach him that we don't. I moved to the window, looking out at my new garden where spring flowers were beginning to bloom. Just weeks ago, I had finally extricated myself from Walter's life. The settlement was complete, the divorce finalized, my new home purchased. I was moving forward, reclaiming dreams long deferred. Did I really want to step back into the vortex of Walter's problems? I'm sorry, Gerald, I said finally. I sympathize with your situation, but I can't be the one to intervene. Walter made his choices. He needs to face the consequences without my involvement. Gerald nodded, not looking particularly surprised. I understand. I wouldn't have asked except that the situation is becoming dire. If his behavior continues, we may be forced to invoke the partnership's disability clause. It would effectively end his career at the firm. After Gerald left, I sat on the window seat, troubled by the encounter. Despite everything Walter had done, despite the pain and humiliation he'd caused, I couldn't feel satisfaction at the thought of his professional downfall. We had built separate lives now, but 50 years of shared history couldn't be erased by legal documents or divided assets. I called James, needing my son's perspective. Have you noticed changes in your father's behavior recently? I asked, after explaining Gerald's visit. James sighed heavily. Yes. When Andrea and I had dinner with him last month, he drank 3 scotches before the main course arrived. He was slurring by dessert. He paused. We've tried talking to him, Mom. He insists everything's fine, that he's just adjusting to change. What about Natalie? Surely she sees the problem. From what Dad said, she's focused on the pregnancy. She's having some complications, been put on bed rest recently. James's voice carried a hint of concern despite his complicated feelings. About his father's new relationship. The whole situation is a mess. After we hung up, I tried to refocus on my house preparations, but Gerald's visit had unsettled me. I found myself remembering moments from our marriage. Walter coaching James's Little League team, patiently helping Andrea with her college applications, the pride in his eyes when I organized a charity auction that raised record funds for the Children's Hospital. Despite his flaws, despite his ultimate betrayal, Walter Jenkins had not been a bad man. Selfish, yes. Controlling, certainly. But not the kind of person who sabotaged his own distinguished career with alcohol and irresponsibility. Something deeper was wrong. That evening, I met Eleanor for dinner at a small Italian restaurant downtown. As always, her practical wisdom provided clarity. You're not responsible for Walter's well-being anymore, Maggie, she reminded me, twirling pasta on her fork. His choices, his consequences. I know, I agreed. But 50 years creates a connection that doesn't simply vanish because a judge signed divorce papers. Eleanor studied me thoughtfully. What are you considering? I sighed, setting down my fork. I don't know. Maybe I should talk to him once, not to fix his problems or take responsibility, but just to understand what's happening. And if understanding doesn't change anything, if he continues self-destructing, then at least I'll know I didn't turn my back completely, I said quietly, for my own peace of mind, not his. Eleanor reached across the table to squeeze my hand. Just be careful, Maggie. Walter's problems have a way of becoming your problems if you let them. The next morning, I called Walter's office, half expecting to be blocked by his assistant. Instead, she sounded relieved to hear from me. "Mrs. Jenkins? I mean, Ms. Cooper," she corrected herself. "Mr. Jenkins doesn't have appointments until this afternoon. I'm sure he'd make time to see you if you'd like to come in." An hour later, I found myself in the familiar lobby of Jenkins Banks and Associates, the law firm Walter had helped build. From a 3-person practice to one of the state's most prestigious, the receptionist greeted me warmly. I'd selected the artwork for these walls, organized the firm's holiday parties for decades. Walter's assistant, Marion, hurried to meet me. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly, leading me toward his corner office. "He's having a difficult morning." I steeled myself before entering, unsure what to expect. The office was as immaculate as always. Walter had never tolerated disorder, but the man behind the desk was almost unrecognizable. In just 2 months since our divorce was finalized, Walter had aged visibly. His face was haggard with dark circles beneath his eyes and a sallowness to his complexion that spoke of poor sleep and poorer nutrition. He looked up as I entered, surprise briefly animating his features before he composed himself. "Margaret, this is unexpected." "Hello, Walter," I said, closing the door behind me. "You look terrible." A ghost of his old smile flickered across his face. Always refreshingly direct. "Please, sit." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. I took the offered seat, noting the slight tremor in his hand as he closed the file he'd been reviewing. "Gerald Banks came to see me yesterday." Walter's expression hardened. "Gerald should mind his own business." "The firm is his business," I pointed out, "and apparently your behavior is affecting it." "I suppose he told you I'm drinking too much," Walter said, a defensive edge to his voice. Exaggerated concerns from overly cautious partners. I studied him, the man I'd woken up beside for 50 years, whose expressions and moods I could read with the precision of long practice. "It's not like you to be unprepared in court, Walter, to miss client meetings, to risk the reputation you've spent a lifetime building." Something flickered in his eyes. Shame, perhaps, or simple awareness that his denials wouldn't work with me. He leaned back in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 74 years. "Everything's changed," he said finally. "The firm, the future I'd planned. Nothing is as it should be." "Because of our divorce." He laughed, a hollow sound without humor. "The divorce is just one piece. Did you know Thompson and Walker are discussing a merger? They've approached our junior partners about joining them." He gestured to the office around him. "This firm has been my life's work, Margaret. If the merger happens, my name won't even be on the door anymore." I hadn't known about the merger talks. It explained some of Gerald's urgency. A partner in crisis would be a liability during delicate negotiations. "And Natalie?" I asked carefully. "I heard there are complications with the pregnancy." Walter's expression softened slightly at the mention of her name, then clouded again. "Preeclampsia. The doctor has her on complete bed rest for the duration. She's frightened, angry, believes I'm not supporting her adequately." He sighed. Heavily. "She's 38, high risk even without complications. I should be at every appointment, holding her hand through every worry." "But you're here instead," I observed. "Drinking in your office and endangering your cases." His eyes flashed with momentary anger. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under. The firm needs me to maintain our client relationships during merger talks. Natalie needs constant reassurance and support. The timing couldn't be worse." I regarded him steadily, seeing with sudden clarity the fundamental flaw that had always defined Walter Jenkins. His absolute certainty that he was indispensable, that every burden must rest on his shoulders alone. "Have you considered that you might need help, Walter? Professional help?" He stiffened. "I don't need a psychiatrist, Margaret. I need fewer demands from people who don't appreciate the sacrifices I'm making." The familiar self-pitying tone stirred old frustrations. How many times during our marriage had Walter positioned himself as the noble martyr, shouldering burdens for an ungrateful world? What you need, I said carefully, is to acknowledge that you can't control everything, that sometimes life unfolds in ways we don't choose or anticipate. He looked away, staring out the window at the city skyline. Is that what you've done? Accepted losing everything we built together. I haven't lost everything, Walter. I've found parts of myself I thought were gone forever. Oh, I leaned forward slightly. And I didn't come here to argue about our marriage. I came because despite everything, I don't want to see you destroy yourself. A long silence stretched between us, filled with 50 years of shared history and the vast, unbridgeable space of our separate futures. The firm has a relationship with Brookhaven, I said finally, referencing a discreet rehabilitation center that had treated several prominent professionals over the years. Gerald mentioned it. They have an executive program. You could frame it as a stress management retreat rather than alcohol treatment if that makes it easier. Walter's jaw tightened. And abandon my clients? Leave Natalie alone when she's already feeling neglected? Your clients will be better served by other partners while you recover than by you in your current state, I said bluntly. As for Natalie, that's between you and her. He studied me, a flicker of his former perception cutting through his self-absorption. Why are you doing this, Margaret? After everything, why help me? I considered the question carefully. Because watching you self-destruct wouldn't bring me any satisfaction. Because our children still need their father, regardless of what happened between us. And because 50 years can't be erased by a few months of pain, no matter how acute. Walter rubbed his face with his hands, the gesture revealing a vulnerability I rarely saw during our marriage. I've made a mess of everything, he said quietly. Yes, I agreed simply. But that doesn't mean you can't begin cleaning it up. When I left Walter's office an hour later, he had agreed to call Brookhaven and inquire about their program. I had no illusions that one conversation had solved his problems. Walter's issues ran deeper than alcohol, stemming from a fundamental inability to adapt when life deviated from his carefully controlled plans. But perhaps I had offered a first step toward recovery. As I walked back to my car, my phone chimed with a text from Diane. Just heard from my editor friend. She wants to see your complete manuscript when you're ready. No rush, but she's definitely interested. Joy rushed through. Me, momentarily pushing aside the lingering heaviness of my conversation with Walter. I texted back quickly. That's wonderful news. I've been working on revisions and should have them completed in a few weeks. Driving back to my new home, I felt a curious lightness despite the emotional complexity of the morning. I had faced Walter, seen the consequences of his choices clearly, and offered what help I could without sacrificing my own boundaries. Our paths had diverged irrevocably, but I could acknowledge our shared history without being pulled back into his orbit. The following weekend, my little bungalow filled with warmth and laughter as James and Andrea hosted my housewarming party. They had invited Eleanor, Patricia, several members of my writing group, and a few neighbors who had welcomed me to the street. The house looked transformed from the empty space Gerald had visited, now furnished with a comfortable mixture of new pieces I'd selected, and a few treasured items I'd taken from my previous life. Mom, this place is perfect for you, Andrea said, admiring the built-in bookshelves now filled with my collection. It feels more like you than any home I remember. I looked around at the colorful throws, the artwork I'd selected purely because it spoke to me, the desk in the second, bedroom where I'd been working on my manuscript revisions. It feels like me, I agreed, for the first time in a very long time. As guests mingled, enjoying the catered appetizers James had arranged, Eleanor pulled me aside. I have something for you, she said, handing me a small package wrapped in silver paper. A proper housewarming gift. Inside was a beautiful leather-bound notebook, its cover embossed with delicate flowers. "For your next story," Eleanor explained, "once you finish the revisions on this one." I hugged her, touched by her confidence in my creative future. Thank you for pushing me to reclaim that part of myself. Later, as the party was winding down, Patricia helped me carry dishes to the kitchen. "Have you heard from Walter since your talk?" she asked. "James told me he's entered the program at Brookhaven," I replied. "A 30-day initial stay, with outpatient follow-up." I loaded glasses into the dishwasher, considering my feelings about Walter's situation. "I hope it helps him." Patricia studied me carefully. "You've forgiven him, haven't you?" "Not entirely," I said truthfully. "But I'm not holding on to anger either. It takes too much energy that I'd rather invest in my own life now." After all the guests had left, I sat alone in my new living room, fireplace casting a warm glow across the hardwood floors. On the coffee table lay my manuscript, the revised version nearly complete, ready to submit to Diane's editor friend. Beside it was Eleanor's gift, waiting to receive whatever story came next. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I opened it to find a message from Natalie. "Walter told me you encouraged him to seek help. Thank you. Whatever our circumstances, I want my child to have a healthy father." I stared at the message, surprised by the unexpected communication. After a moment's consideration, I typed back, "I wish you both well, and a safe delivery for your child." Setting down the phone, I picked up Eleanor's notebook, running my fingers over its smooth leather cover. The future stretched before me, unscripted for the first time in decades. There would be challenges ahead, financial adjustments as I learned to manage independently, emotional hurdles as Walter's new child entered the world, the vulnerability of submitting my creative work for potential rejection. But for tonight, in this house that was solely mine, surrounded by choices I had made freely, I felt a deep sense of rightness. At 72, I was not merely surviving divorce or recovering from betrayal. I was discovering that the woman who existed beyond the boundaries of wife, mother, and perfect partner was someone I genuinely liked. Someone creative, resilient, and capable of building a life entirely her own. The doorbell rang, pulling me from my reflections. Opening it, I found James on the porch, holding a small potted orchid. "Found this in my car," he explained. "Must have forgotten to bring it in with the other gifts." "Thank you, sweetheart," I said, taking the delicate plant. "It's beautiful." James lingered, seeming to have something on his mind. "I talked to Dad this morning," he finally said. He sounded different, more like his old self, before everything fell apart. I nodded, setting the orchid on a side table. "The program is structured. It probably helps him feel he has some control again. He mentioned you visited him at the office." James studied me curiously. "After everything he put you through, you still cared enough to try to help him." "It wasn't really about him," I explained, realizing the truth as I spoke it. "It was about who I want to be. Indifference would have been easier, but it's not who I am. Not who you and Andrea learned compassion from." James hugged me suddenly, tightly. "You're remarkable, Mom. I hope you know that." After he left, I returned to the living room, picking up the new notebook once more. Its blank pages represented possibilities I was only beginning to imagine. I opened to the first page, and with a sense of quiet ceremony, wrote my name. Maggie Cooper. Not Margaret Jenkins, the name I had worn for 50 years. Not even Margaret. Cooper, my formal birth name. But Maggie, the name I had chosen for myself at the writing group, the name that felt authentically mine. Below it, I wrote the title of a new story, one that had been forming in my mind these past weeks. Not a children's book this time, but something for women who, like me, were discovering themselves after decades of living in the shadows of others' needs and expectations. As I began to write, words flowing more easily than I could have imagined, I felt a certainty I had rarely experienced. The journey ahead might be uncharted, the path sometimes difficult, but for the first time in 50 years, I was walking it exactly as I chose, not as someone's wife, not as the perfect supporter of another's dreams, but as Maggie Cooper, author of her own life story. Autumn painted the trees in brilliant hues of amber and crimson as I placed the final box on my desk. 6 months had passed since I'd moved into my bungalow, and now I was arranging my new home office. The second bedroom, once a catch-all space for half-unpacked boxes and occasional visitors, was transforming into a proper writer's sanctuary. "A bit to the left," Eleanor directed from the doorway, eyeing the framed cover art that James was hanging on the wall. "Perfect." The artwork displayed the whimsical illustration for The Girl Who Heard Flowers, my children's book that would hit bookstore shelves next spring. Little Harbor Press had not only accepted my revised manuscript, but had paired me with a talented, young illustrator whose vision complemented my story beautifully. The advance had been modest, but the validation was priceless. "It looks so official," I said, stepping back to admire the framed artwork, like something a real author would have. "You are a real author," Eleanor reminded me. "Contract signed, advance cashed, publication date set." James finished securing the frame and joined us in admiring it. "Dad would never believe this," he said, then immediately looked chagrined. "Sorry, Mom, I didn't mean to bring him up." "It's all right," I assured him. "Your father is part of our family story, even now." Walter had completed his 30 days at Brookhaven and was continuing with outpatient treatment. According to James and Andrea, who maintained cautious relationships with their father, he was sober and working reduced hours at the firm. The merger. Talks had proceeded, but Walter had negotiated to keep the Jenkins name on the letterhead, a small victory that seemed to matter greatly to him. As for Natalie, her pregnancy had stabilized after a difficult second trimester. She was due in December, and Walter had purchased a new home closer to her parents in Connecticut. Life continued to evolve for all of us, our paths occasionally intersecting but fundamentally separate. "Let's celebrate your new office," Eleanor suggested. I brought Prosecco. We gathered in the kitchen where Patricia was arranging a cheese platter. My sister had been instrumental in helping me establish my new home, from furniture shopping to gardening advice. Now she poured champagne into 3 flutes, raising hers in a toast. "To new beginnings," she said, "and to the remarkable woman who's brave enough to embrace them." We clinked glasses, the simple moment of celebration warming me more than the sparkling wine. 6 months earlier, I could not have imagined this scene, standing in my own kitchen, surrounded by people who valued me for exactly who I was, anticipating the publication of a book I had written. "The writers group wants to host a pre-publication party when the release date gets closer," Eleanor mentioned as we moved to the living room. "Diane's already planning it." The Oak Ridge Writers Circle had become a central part of my new life. I attended every Thursday without fail, sharing my progress and offering feedback on others' work. What had begun as a tentative return to creativity had blossomed into a genuine community of fellow writers who understood the unique challenges and joys of putting words on the page. "That's so thoughtful," I said, touched by their support. "I'd be honored." James checked his watch. "I should head out. Promised Andrea I'd help her with the kids this afternoon." He hugged me warmly. "I'm proud of you, Mom. Really proud." After he left, Eleanor, Patricia, and I continued our celebration, the conversation flowing easily from book plans to community events to Patricia's upcoming retirement from her nursing career. As dusk fell, casting long shadows across my cozy living room, I felt a profound sense of contentment. The path to this moment had been painful at times, but I wouldn't trade the hard-won peace I'd found for anything. "Earth to Maggie," Patricia said, waving her hand in front of my face. "You Disappeared into your thoughts again. Eleanor asked about your other writing project. I smiled apologetically. Sorry. Yes, I've been working on it between revisions for the children's book. It's coming along slowly, but I'm not rushing it. The other project was the memoir I'd begun the night I'd written my name, my true name, Maggie Cooper, in Eleanor's gift notebook. Initially intended as a therapeutic exercise, it had evolved into something more structured, a reflection on identity, resilience, and rediscovering oneself after decades of living primarily for others. Any thoughts about trying to publish it eventually? Eleanor asked. Maybe, I admitted. But for now, I'm writing it for myself, and perhaps for other women who might recognize their own experiences in mine. The doorbell chimed, interrupting our conversation. I excused myself to answer it, surprised by the unexpected visitor. Opening the door, I found Andrea on my doorstep, her expression troubled. "Mom, I'm sorry to barge in," she said, stepping inside. I tried calling, but it went straight to voicemail. I checked my phone, realizing I'd left it on silent after the writing group meeting earlier that day. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" "It's Dad," she said, lowering her voice as she noticed Eleanor and Patricia in the living room. "He's at the hospital. Natalie went into premature labor. She's only at 32 weeks. He called James in a panic, and James is already on his way there." Concern immediately supplanted my peaceful mood. "Is Natalie all right? The baby?" "We don't know much yet. Dad was pretty incoherent on the phone." Andrea hesitated. "I know it's awkward, but I thought you should know. It's still our half-sibling." I squeezed her hand, appreciating her thoughtfulness. "Thank you for telling me. Do you want to go to the hospital?" She nodded. "James is there already. I'd feel better being there too, at least until we know more." I turned to Eleanor and Patricia, who had discreetly moved to the kitchen to give us privacy. "I'm sorry to cut our celebration short." "Don't apologize," Patricia said firmly. "Family comes first, complicated as it may be. Do you want me to drive you?" I considered the offer, then shook my head. "I think Andrea and I will go together." I met my daughter's eyes. "If that's all right with you?" The drive to Hartford Hospital took nearly an hour, giving Andrea and me time to talk. She had been the more visibly angry of my children when Walter's affair was revealed, her sense of justice deeply offended by his betrayal. "How are you feeling about all this?" I asked as we navigated the evening traffic. A new sibling is a significant change, especially under these circumstances. Andrea kept her eyes on the road, her profile reminiscent of her father's in its determined set. "Honestly, it's strange. I'm 41 with children of my own, and suddenly I'll have a newborn sibling." She sighed. "But it's not the baby's fault how they came into the world. And seeing Dad these past months, struggling, trying to get sober, preparing for this child, I felt some of my anger fading." "That's very mature of you," I said softly. She glanced at me briefly. "I learned forgiveness from you, Mom. After everything Dad put you through, you still encouraged him to get help when he was falling apart." "Forgiveness isn't about excusing what happened," I clarified. "It's about not letting it consume you. Your father made choices that hurt us deeply, but holding on to that pain would only have limited my own life." Hartford Hospital's emergency. Entrance was brightly lit against the darkening sky. As we parked, Andrea's phone chimed with a text from James. "5th floor, maternity wing. Dad's in the waiting area." The elevator ride to the 5th floor felt surreal. Just months ago, I had been Margaret Jenkins, Walter's wife of 50 years. Now, I was voluntarily entering a hospital where my ex-husband awaited the premature birth of his child with another woman. Life took unexpected turns indeed. James met us in the hallway outside the maternity wing, his expression a mixture of concern and awkwardness. "Mom, you didn't have to come," he said, hugging me briefly. "How is everything?" I asked, ignoring his implicit question about my presence. Natalie's in surgery, emergency C-section. Dad's pretty shaken up. James lowered his voice. The baby's heart rate was dropping. They're concerned about oxygen levels. Andrea squeezed her brother's arm. Where's Dad now? In the waiting room. They won't let him into the surgical suite. I hesitated, suddenly uncertain about my place in this situation. I had come to support my children, but would my presence only complicate an already stressful moment for Walter? James seemed to read my hesitation. It's up to you, Mom. I can tell Dad you're here, or you can wait somewhere else if that's more comfortable. After a moment's consideration, I made my decision. I'll come to the waiting room. Whatever our past, we're all concerned for Natalie and the baby right now. The maternity waiting room was softly lit, with comfortable seating and calming. Artwork on the walls. Walter sat alone in a corner, his tall frame hunched forward, head in his hands. He looked up as we entered, and the naked vulnerability in his expression struck me forcefully. This was not the confident attorney who had dominated courtrooms and boardrooms for decades, but a frightened man facing circumstances beyond his control. Andrea, James, he acknowledged, then froze when he saw me. Margaret, what are you doing here? Andrea told me what was happening, I said simply. I came to support our children. And to hope for the best for Natalie and your baby. Something in Walter's expression crumpled slightly. Thank you, he said, his voice rough with emotion. The doctors say there are complications. The umbilical cord is wrapped around the baby's neck. They're doing everything they can, but... He trailed off, unable to complete the thought. Andrea moved to sit beside her father, taking his hand in a gesture of comfort that would have been unimaginable 6 months earlier. James remained standing, his protective instincts clearly divided between his father's distress and concern about my comfort in this situation. Can I get anyone coffee? I offered, needing a moment to process the complex emotions swirling through me. James nodded gratefully. I'll help you. As we walked toward the small refreshment area, James spoke quietly. You're incredible, you know that? Most people in your position wouldn't be here. I selected cups from a stack near the coffee machine. I'm not here for Walter. I'm here because a child is being born under difficult circumstances, and because you and Andrea needed support. I paused, considering my next words carefully. But I'm also here because harboring bitterness would only poison my own life. I've worked too hard to reclaim my happiness to let that happen. James helped me prepare 4 coffees, adding cream and sugar according to each person's preference. A family ritual so ingrained he performed it automatically. As we carried the cups back to the waiting area, a doctor in surgical scrubs entered, her expression serious but not grim. Mr. Jenkins? She said, approaching Walter. Walter stood immediately, tension visible in every line of his body. Yes? How is Natalie? The baby? Ms. Harrison is stable, the doctor assured him. The cesarean went as well as could be expected, under the circumstances. She paused. Your son was born at 6:42 p.m., weighing 4 pounds, 3 ounces. He's experiencing some respiratory distress, which is common with premature births, and we've transferred him to the NICU. But he's alive? Walter asked, his voice cracking. Yes. He's receiving oxygen support and will remain in the NICU for monitoring. The next 48 hours will be critical, but he's showing good signs of fighting spirit. The doctor's expression softened slightly. Congratulations, Mr. Jenkins. Would you like to see him? Walter glanced at James and Andrea, then briefly at me, as if seeking permission or reassurance. Yes, he said finally. Yes, I would. I'll take you to the NICU, the doctor offered. You'll need to wash thoroughly and wear protective gear, but you can see him through the incubator. As Walter prepared to follow the doctor, He turned to me unexpectedly. "Margaret," he said, his voice low. "Thank you for being here. It means more than I can express." I nodded, acknowledging his gratitude without needing to verbalize my complicated feelings. Some journeys weren't meant to be shared, and Walter was embarking on one I would observe only from a distance. After Walter left with the doctor, Andrea, James, and I sat in contemplative silence, the reality of having a new half-sibling entering the world settling over them. "Did Dad mention what they're naming him?" I asked eventually. James shook his head. "Not to me." "William," Andrea supplied. "After Dad's father, William Thomas Jenkins." The name choice surprised me slightly. Walter had had a complex relationship with his father, a stern, demanding man whose approval had always seemed just beyond Walter's reach. Perhaps becoming a father again in his 70s had shifted Walter's perspective on that relationship. We remained in the waiting room for another hour until Walter returned, his expression transformed. Gone was the fear and uncertainty, replaced by a look of wonder I remembered well from James and Andrea's births. "He's so small," Walter said, his voice hushed with awe. "Smaller than either of you were, but the nurse said he's strong for his gestational age." He sat heavily, emotional exhaustion evident. "Natalie is still in recovery. She won't be able to see him until tomorrow." "How is she?" Andrea asked, genuine concern in her voice despite the complicated circumstances. "Stable. The doctor said the surgery went well, but she lost more blood than they liked. She'll need to stay in the hospital for at least a week." Walter ran a hand through his silver hair, a gesture so familiar it caused an unexpected pang of recognition. "I don't know how I'm going to manage everything. The house isn't ready yet. We were supposed to have 2 more months. What do you need help with?" James asked, stepping naturally into a supportive role. Walter looked surprised by the offer, then grateful. "The nursery furniture was delivered, but it's not assembled, and the house needs cleaning before Natalie comes home with the baby." "I can help with that," James said. "I'm decent with assembly. Instructions." "I can coordinate meals," Andrea offered after a moment's hesitation. "Some of the other mothers from my kids' school would help, I'm sure." Walter's eyes filled with tears, something I had rarely seen during our 50 years together. "I don't deserve your kindness," he said quietly. "Either of you." "No," Andrea agreed bluntly. "But William does. And we're his family too." I excused myself to find the restroom, needing a moment alone to process the evening's events. In the quiet privacy of the hospital bathroom, I studied my reflection in the mirror. The woman who looked back at me had changed subtly but significantly over the past year. There was a confidence in her eyes, a serenity in her expression that hadn't been there before. What a strange, unpredictable journey life could be. A year ago, I had been preparing for my 50th anniversary, unaware that my marriage was already over in all but name. Now I stood in a hospital where my ex-husband's new child had just been born prematurely, observing my adult children demonstrate a capacity for forgiveness and family loyalty that filled me with quiet pride. When I returned to the waiting room, a nurse was speaking with Walter and our children. "Ms. Harrison is awake and asking for you," she told Walter. "She's still quite groggy from the anesthesia, but you can see her briefly." Walter nodded, then turned to James and Andrea. "Would you like to come? I know it's awkward, but she's going to be William's mother, your brother's mother." The olive branch wasn't lost on any of us. After a moment's hesitation, both James and Andrea agreed to a brief visit. Walter looked at me questioningly, but I shook my head slightly. There were boundaries that needed to be maintained, for my well-being and for Natalie's comfort. "I'll head home," I said. "Please let me know how Natalie and William are doing." As I gathered my purse, Walter stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Margaret." "Maggie," he corrected himself, using the name I had reclaimed. I never properly thanked you for encouraging me to seek help. These past months haven't been easy, but I'm sober. Thinking clearly for the first time in years, really. I'm glad, I said sincerely. Sobriety suits you, and William deserves a present, healthy father. Walter nodded, a flash of the old perceptiveness in his eyes. You look well. Happy, even. The house in Oak Ridge agrees with you. It's not just the house, I replied. It's discovering who I am when I'm not defined by being your wife. The children mentioned you're publishing a book? Yes, a children's story, actually. One I first wrote 30 years ago. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. The one about the little girl who could hear plants talking? You still had that? The fact that he remembered the story at all surprised me. He had been so dismissive when I first wrote it that I assumed he'd barely registered the content. Yes, I confirmed. Little Harbor Press is publishing it next spring. Something like regret passed across Walter's features. I should have encouraged you back then. Instead, He trailed off, then straightened his shoulders. Congratulations, Maggie, truly. Thank you, I said, accepting the belated support with grace. I should go. Give Natalie my best wishes for her recovery. As I walked toward the elevator, Andrea hurried to catch up with me. Mom, wait. Let me drive you home. I'm perfectly capable of driving myself, I assured her. I know that, she said, linking her arm through mine. But I'd like to spend the time with you if that's okay. We can talk on the way. The drive back to Oak Ridge was quieter than our journey to the hospital, both of us processing the evening's events in our own ways. As we neared my neighborhood, Andrea finally broke the silence. You could have refused to come tonight. You could have been bitter or angry, and everyone would have understood why. I watched the familiar streets pass by, houses warm with evening lights. What purpose would that have served? Being angry with Walter doesn't hurt him. It only hurts me. And despite everything, I want you and James to have a relationship with your father, and now with your half-brother. That's remarkably generous, Andrea observed. It's not generosity, I corrected gently. It's self-preservation. I spent 50 years organizing my life around Walter's needs and expectations. I won't spend what remains of it allowing his choices to determine my happiness. Andrea pulled into my driveway, but made no move to turn off the engine. Will you want to meet him? William, I mean. When he's stronger. The question gave me pause. I hadn't considered this possibility, though perhaps I should have. I don't know, I answered honestly. That might be a bridge too far, at least for now. But I'm glad you and James will be part of his life. Andrea leaned over to hug me. I love you, Mom. You've taught me so much this past year about dignity and strength. After she drove away, I entered my quiet house, immediately comforted by its welcoming atmosphere. I made a cup of herbal tea and carried it to my new office, sitting at the desk where my writing projects awaited. The framed cover art for The Girl Who Heard Flowers seemed to glow in the soft lamplight, a tangible reminder of dreams deferred but not forgotten. Opening my laptop, I returned to the memoir I'd been working on before the evening's unexpected events. The words flowed easily, my experiences at the hospital providing new perspective on the journey I'd been documenting. There was a symmetry to it all, as Walter began a new chapter of fatherhood in his 70s. I was embarking on my long-delayed career as an author. 2 weeks later, on a crisp Sunday morning, I was preparing for the writing group's monthly workshop when my doorbell rang. Opening it, I found James on my doorstep, his expression tentative. Mom, do you have a minute? There's someone I'd like you to meet. Stepping aside, he revealed Andrea standing behind him, carefully cradling a tiny bundle wrapped in a pale blue blanket. My breath caught as I realized what was happening. William was released from the NICU yesterday, Andrea explained softly. We thought you might want to meet him, if you're comfortable with that. I hesitated only briefly before nodding and stepping back to invite them in. Andrea moved to my sofa and gently shifted the blanket to reveal a tiny, perfect face. William? Thomas Jenkins had Walter's strong chin and what looked like Natalie's delicate nose, his small features still fluid with newness. Would you like to hold him? Andrea offered. Are you sure? I asked, suddenly uncertain. Does Natalie know you've brought him here? James nodded. It was her idea, actually, she said. He paused, choosing his words carefully. She said William should know the woman who raised such compassionate children. That regardless of the circumstances, you're part of his family story too. The unexpected generosity from Natalie touched me deeply. She had no obligation to include me in her child's life. Yet she had recognized the complex web of relationships that would always connect us through James and Andrea. I sat beside Andrea, and she carefully transferred the tiny baby into my arms. He weighed almost nothing, this new person who connected to my life in such an unexpected way. His eyes opened briefly, dark blue, as all newborns are, and seemed to focus on my face for a moment before closing again. Hello, William, I said softly. Welcome to the world. As I held him, I thought about the strange, unpredictable paths life takes us down. A year ago, I could never have imagined this moment. The pain of Walter's betrayal had been so acute, the public humiliation so complete, that the idea of holding his child with another woman would have seemed impossible. Yet here I was, rocking this innocent baby who knew nothing of the complicated adult circumstances surrounding his birth. He was simply a new life, full of possibilities, connected to mine through the children I had raised and loved. After William was settled back in Andrea's arms, James handed me an envelope. Dad asked me to give you this. You don't have to read it now. Or ever, if you don't want to. I accepted the envelope without comment, setting it aside for later consideration. Whatever Walter needed to say, it could wait until after this peaceful family moment. That evening, after my visitors had left and the house was quiet once more, I finally opened Walter's letter. His familiar handwriting filled a single page, the message brief but heartfelt. Maggie. Words seem inadequate after 50 years together and the pain of our parting. I won't ask for forgiveness I haven't earned, but I want you to know that I recognize the strength and grace you've shown throughout this difficult year. When I look at William, I think about the family we built together, about the beautiful children you raised so well that they can find room in their hearts for their father despite his failures. That speaks volumes about the woman who molded them. I wish you every happiness in your new life and your writing career. The world needs more stories that help us hear what we might otherwise miss, whether it's flowers speaking or the quiet voice of our authentic selves. With respect and gratitude. Walter. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my desk drawer. It wasn't an apology exactly, nor did it need to be. It was an acknowledgement of my worth, my contribution, and my right to the life I was creating for myself. The next morning, I woke early and made coffee, carrying it to the small patio where my garden was showing the first signs of spring renewal. Daffodils pushed through the rich soil, their yellow heads nodding in the gentle breeze. I had planted them last fall, my first winter in this house still ahead of me then, an act of faith in future seasons. My phone chimed with a message from Diane. Final cover art for The Girl Who Heard Flowers just approved by the publisher. Can't wait to celebrate with you at writing group tomorrow. I smiled, anticipation warming me more than the coffee. In my office awaited the memoir pages I'd been working on, now approaching completion. On my calendar, a book signing was penciled, in for next spring, along with a children's reading program at the library. Life stretched before me, rich with possibilities I was only beginning to explore. At 72, I had discovered that endings often contain the seeds of new beginnings, if we're brave enough to nurture them. The woman I had been, the supportive wife, the perfect hostess, the silent partner in Walter's ambitions, had not. Vanished, but transformed. She had become someone stronger, someone who understood that her voice deserved to be heard, her dreams pursued, her life lived authentically. I sipped my coffee, watching the morning light strengthen across my garden. William would grow up knowing his half-siblings, perhaps even forming relationships with them that would enrich his life. Walter would continue his recovery, learning to be a father again under very different circumstances than before. Natalie would navigate new motherhood with its challenges and joys. And I would continue writing stories, building friendships, and creating a life that reflected my truest self. The gold band I had worn for 50 years no longer circled my finger, but something more valuable had taken its place, a sense of purpose, of identity beyond the roles that had defined me for. So long. The anniversary that had begun with betrayal had ultimately given me an unexpected gift, the freedom to discover who Maggie Cooper truly was and the courage to become her fully at last. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.